Tessa was born here in Paris, Kentucky, and attended Morehead State University. I believe was your degree in English? Is that what I read?
Business education.
Business education. And currently you reside in Dallas, Texas, correct?
Yes, in Dallas County.
Dallas County. And you published this book in 2021.
Yes.
Through the Murky Press. And so you conducted your research on this book over about 2 years, wasn't it? A year and a half or 2 years?
It was kind of spotty. You know, when I first learned about it, it was in 2013, and then I stopped, and then I picked up later, or maybe about 7 years later. So.
And then Sallie, who did not know of her Paris connections until she began researching her family, studied comparative literature at the University of North Carolina, go Tar Heels, I guess, since they won last night, and was an editor and writer and educator, and is the owner-operator of the Murky Press, which published both of these books and currently lives in Lexington. So I will turn it over to you two ladies if you would like to say anything else, but to kind of get us started, I first wanted you all to explain to our audience kind of how you all came to connect with each other through these stories and what kind of inspired you to start this really process of research and writing and reminding people of these histories that are overlapping and connecting. Sallie, especially about how, you didn't know about certain parts of your family until you started doing this research. So just sort of, what made you all decide to start this process and how did you all come together to work with each other?
You want me to start out, Sallie?
Yes.
Okay. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank the Hopewell Museum for hosting this Zoom meeting and for everyone joining this important conversation about our history. Now, parts of our history is difficult to discuss because it can be dark and depressing, but it's critical to acknowledge, understand, and learn lessons. Both white and Black people were lynched in our history, but mostly among Blacks, and that is because it was a tool to enforce racial subordination and terrorism. And we cannot heal from this dark past until we tell the truth about it. So I first learned about this lynching, I was 60 plus years old. It was in November 2013, and I was going through Mom's box of mementos. She was a collector, and she had a box of things like photographs, newspaper clippings. And in that box, I found a newspaper clipping dated in 1978. It was published by Paris Daily Enterprise, and it was called A Skeleton in Bourbon's Closet. The author was Roger Cold Iron, and he had interviewed Bourbon County historian Edna Talbot Whitley, and it was about the lynching of a young Black man in the courthouse square. Mrs. Whitley was almost 10 years old at that time, and she remembered that the incident took place during her 1900 to 1901 school year. She was being driven to school in a carriage by one of her father's employees, and the driver always traveled past the Bourbon County courthouse, but that particular day, he took a detour down Pleasant Street to probably avoid seeing that terrible sight. I don't know if you want to put that up now, maybe briefly, Cheryl, of that sight that they avoided that day. Maybe just for a few seconds.
Working on it. My computer just decided to go
well,
slow.
Go on as you are saying, finding that. And I just wanted to read a portion of what Cold Iron wrote. He wrote in the paper, a young Black man had been hanged from a large iron gate that stood in front of the old courthouse. The gate now stands beside Duncan Tavern, its cast iron legs covered with stone. And he went on to state that the man's name is unknown, lost, perhaps along with the courthouse records that burned along with the building a year later. No facts can be confirmed through any newspaper accounts of the day, and there is no mention of it in any of them. After getting over the initial shock of finding out about this story, this incident, I immediately grabbed my camera and headed down to view the gate and took several photographs. And one of those photographs is located after the table of contents in my book. And the article left me yearning for more information. So I decided to apply my genealogy research skills to find answers to the questions plaguing me. And that was who, what, and why. So doing my initial research, I discovered that the lynching occurred in the early mornings, around about maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning on February the 11th, 1901. The Black man was 21-year-old George Thomas Carter. The white woman assaulted was 33-year-old Mary Lake Board. And walking with her that winter day was her son, 8-year-old William Lyons Board. And he went by his middle name, Lyons. So one of the most surprising things that I learned from the crime, from that incident, was that the crime reported after the lynching. Newspapers widely reported that George attempted to rape a white woman on the 2nd Street Bridge over Houston Creek. However, the actual crime was an attempted purse snatching. So there was injustice on top of injustice. So rape was a frequent justification for racist violence. And reports of it sent the country into a murderous frenzy. So another surprising factor that I learned was that George's arrest was due to his 2 charges his sister-in-law brought against him. It was not about the assault of Mary Lake Board. So on the 70th day after the purse snatching incident, and on the 7th day of being jailed, George Carter lost his life. He was lynched. So I began to exchange information with my friend Lindro Blackwell, who thought I should write a newspaper article about my findings. I soon put aside my research, and like I said, until about 7 years later, when Lindro connected me with one of the descendants of the man lynched. That man happened to be James Bannister. Jim's grandmother is Katie Carter, who happened to be the baby sister of George Carter. And Cheryl, can you put up her photograph, Katie Carter's photograph? Yes, thank you. That's the one. So Jim had a very special bond with his grandmother, but she shared with him only bits and pieces of what happened. He wanted to know more, and I decided I wanted to help him know. And so within a couple of weeks, I started my research again. And I Googled George Carter, Paris, Kentucky, 1901. One of the results grabbed my attention because it was a 2019 blog called Time Stands Still. Its author wrote about her grandfather come to grips with the perverted justice he witnessed as an 8-year-old boy in Paris, Kentucky. So I decided I wanted to reach out to the blogger. Perhaps she had additional information that she could share with me. So her response was quick. I got a response the same day, and it was utterly mind-blowing because the blogger was Sallie Showalter, the great-granddaughter of Mary Lake Board, who was assaulted by a Black man on her way home at dusk in December 1900. I was right in the middle of researching Sallie's family. I was getting all into her family business and her ancestors. And so it was rather comical because through my research, I actually knew more about Sallie's ancestors than she did. And so we began to exchange information, and I was really afraid that Sallie might be upset by what I was doing, trying to find out information about her family. But she was very gracious, and she actually, shared, I believe that Sallie wanted to know more also about what happened, because there was so much silence back then, and what we have today is just bits and pieces of information. So we began to share information about the subject matter. And it was also mind-blowing that Sallie is a professional writer. She's an author, an editor, and a publisher. So many of you will be surprised to hear that my intent was never to write a book. But through Sallie's encouragement, my goal to write a newspaper article quickly evolved into a book. And Sallie generously shared her time and information, including the book she wrote about her grandfather, William Lyons Board. Her book is called Next Train Out, which I know she'll cover that. So to me, surely the Lord opened doors for me to find Jim Bannister and Sallie Showalter. The time was ripe for the wall of silence to come down. And the three of us share a common bond through a 1901 incident, and now a beautiful friendship flourishes between us. And I'll conclude on this matter that with Mr. Cold Iron's words, he said that a mistake may have been made on that winter day. And if so, it should never be forgotten, but remembered, and from the memory, a lesson learned.
Thanks, Tessa. That covers pretty much the story of how Tessa and I first met. And as she just indicated, we have spent the last, year and a half communicating regularly, working on the project of publishing her book and sharing fascinating tidbits of my family. She continues to dig up, all scandalous, of course. I don't think she's got it positive yet.
Yeah.
But I'll jump backwards. The blog that she discovered had been part of my effort to promote a couple of books that I had published through Murky Press. One was initially a book about, it included some of my father's writings. And the second was this novel I wrote talking about my grandfather's life. And that came about because let me jump back. My grandfather, William Lyons Board, she's introduced, who was indeed the 8-year-old who was with his mother on 2nd Street Bridge, according to the newspaper articles, when his mother was allegedly assaulted. And he was the one, the 8-year-old was the one eventually who was taken to the Bourbon County Jail and asked to identify Mr. George Carter, who they had in custody, not for the assault on my great-grandmother, but for an alleged assault that his sister-in-law had accused him of. My grandfather at 8 years old was asked to identify George Carter as the man who had attacked his own mother when he was there. And he did that. And it was reported in the newspaper that as this 8-year-old boy had identified this man, and the newspaper indicated that justice would be swift. And it was implied, and in fact, it was written clearly that they expected a lynching in days. So that is unfortunately exactly what happened. I didn't know any of this story. All I knew is that my mother, who was born in 1921, I did know that her father was from Paris, but I knew nothing about him because just days after she was born, he disappeared. And as far as I knew, nobody in my mother's family ever knew what happened to him. And I don't know if even Lyon's mother, Mary Lake Board, I don't know even that she knew where he went or what happened to him. So I happened to be sharing this story with a neighbor of mine at the time, maybe around 2010, 2012, Chuck Camp, who was a good friend of mine, who also happened to be a retired investigative journalist and a man who loves stories. So when I shared with him just a little bit about my grandfather, I could tell he was interested. He went home shortly thereafter, called me 2 or 3 hours later, and asked if I really wanted to know the story of my grandfather, because what he had uncovered was surprising and it rolled into a story that we never, ever could have expected. So Chuck took much time over the next several years and unraveling or discovering these pieces of information about my grandfather's life. And just briefly, he had been born in Paris in 1892 to an established family there. He had served in World War I in France, and he had come back and kind of unexpectedly resettled in Paris and married my grandmother. Yes, thank you, Cheryl. We don't know for sure, but we suspect that this is an image of my grandfather, William Lyons Board. So as my friend Chuck started feeding me all these details about his life, we started talking about how to preserve that information and share it more widely. And we eventually settled on the fact that it needed to be a novel for all kinds of reasons. Neither he nor I had experience writing a novel, so that created another challenge, and I worked very closely with the Carnegie Center of Literacy and Learning in Lexington, trying to learn how to construct a novel about this man's life. But it was a couple of years later, and it was probably about that same time, Tessa, 2013, when you discovered the article about George Carter, that I got an email late at night when I was at work from my friend Chuck, telling me that he had discovered this article actually in a California newspaper that put my great-grandmother, Mary Lake Board, you can put that photo up if you have it, Cheryl, that she had been involved in this incident on the 2nd Street Bridge in Paris, where she had allegedly been assaulted, and then there had been a lynching. And so we were both stunned, of course. This was news that was spread far and wide across the United States. And at first, Chuck did not think that was indeed my great-grandmother, but eventually we learned it was. So that is when we started learning this aspect of my grandfather's story, that he was the 8-year-old boy who identified George Carter as he was being held in the jail. So eventually I wrote the novel, and I decided that this had to be an integral part of my grandfather's psyche. Of course, I don't know how he responded to this incident. I don't know whether he was horrified by what happened to the man who he identified at the jail, or whether he felt like he had vindicated his mother's assault, and whether he was praised by the white community in Paris at the time. I have no way of knowing that, but I had to wrap that story somehow into his life story that I wrote about in the novel. So that continuing, as I continue to write about him and I continue to learn more about his life, then I have maintain my blog with some updates. And I have another great story that Tessa has shared with me that I haven't even shared yet about Lion's uncle. I will get to that one very soon, I hope.
Oh, that was a scary one.
Thank you. And that kind of leads me into sort of the other part of this that I was interested in, and what I'm learning about. When I first heard about this, I believe, when Tessa and Lindrell and Sallie, you all reached out to us in, I guess, 2020 now. I mean, it's hard to believe it was 2 years ago. And, I had only really briefly learned about this, event in Paris's history when I had first started here at the museum at the beginning of 2019. And then learning more from the conversation that Sallie and Jim had, one of the things that I really ended up myself personally coming away with that I wanted to know more about was what happened to the families, what happened to the women, involved after this happened, to Mary Board, to Katie Carter, how this impacted them, what happened to George's children. And those were questions that I had tried to find out myself, just out of pure interest. And, and then I read, Tessa's book. And so I just, I would like you all, if you all could, to share a little bit more about, how you found out that information, how you made those connections with his, with the descendants, and sort of, what became of the families after this happened. I know Sallie's book covers this a lot too with Lions, but that was just a really, fascinating aspect to it for me.
No, Cheryl, it's we could only speculate because of the passage of time. It's hard to say what they really felt. So I just had to mentally put myself in the place of George Carter's wife. Her name was Mary Eliza. But I can only imagine the pain and trauma that she underwent. First, she had to mentally process that her husband was accused of attempted sexual assault of her 15-year-old sister, Bessie. They all lived in the same house. And so it sounded like it was close quarters just based on the census report. And and this attempted sexual assault, Bessie brought charges against him. This led to his arrest. And as I said, on the 7th day of his jail confinement, Mary Eliza had to mentally process that her husband was brutally lynched by a mob for reasons unrelated to the situation with Bessie. She's just, after 7 days of his jail confinement, she was now a widow with 2 young daughters. Her name was Lily Mae and Carrie. And both of these children were under the age of 3. And Mary Eliza was immediately now the primary caretaker and breadwinner for her young family. So what I could research through Ancestry.com and other documents, I traced that family, George Carter's wife's family, her Mary Eliza, and also her siblings and her mother. They actually relocated to Ohio, and lynchings and violence, along with better job opportunities, actually played a key role for the migration of Black people to the North. And so this is definitely the case for Mary Eliza and her family. And so the entire Thompson household, including Bessie, left Kentucky sometime after the lynching. I just don't know exactly when. And one person, I don't know if she's on the call, this meeting, that I met through genealogy was Marjorie Ramsey. Is she on the line?
I don't see her on here. I don't see a Marjorie on here.
Okay. So when I met her, she turned out to be the great niece of Bessie. And so she did not know anything about the incident, the lynching incident, and of course about her family. So she learned of many things just by reading my book. So it was all a surprise to her. And I asked her to join the call. I wanted her to kind of speak on behalf of her family, how they felt, and after she shared this information with them. So unfortunately, she's not with us. So maybe later she'll join. And but on the other hand, George's parents and siblings, they remained in Paris, and that's probably because George's father, his name was Thomas. He had deep roots in Paris. He had actually purchased 2 lots of land in Ruckerville, and he actually built himself. He built these 2 homes on the property. So I felt that probably that kept him in Paris. I think there's something after witnessing the lynching of your son, and he was the one actually cut down his son from the lynch, from the noose. And so I would think that they would be pretty much traumatized. Also, we mentioned his youngest sister, Katie. She was only 5 years old when George was lynched. And her grandson, Jim Bannister, he shared with us that Katie grieves silently the remainder of her life. So that was, but she remained in Paris. And I spoke with Sallie about her great grandmother, Mary Lake Board. I don't know if she wants to cover that or not. Did you want to say anything about?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it because
Okay.
The contrast is so jarring, as you can imagine. So Tessa has talked about George Carter's family, who either fled the state after this incident or stayed heroically in Paris and tried to rebuild their lives without their son. So the newspaper article that surrounded this incident said that Mary Lake Board and Mrs. William Ellery Board was prostrate with nervousness for some days after the initial assault. But then in a short order, she was very busy again with her bridge parties and her whist parties and her luncheons and her teas. And she was a very socially active woman, her DAR meetings. And these were all heavily covered in the local newspapers, perhaps because her best friend was the publisher of the Bourbon News, Swift Champ's wife, and her cousin was Bruce Miller, who published the Kentuckian Citizen. So she had, her family had close ties to the local newspapers and the publishers of those papers, and her goings and comings were very closely followed. So it appears that after some short period of time, she simply reverted to her life of whirlwind social activities. Now, what her emotional response was to this incident, both the initial assault and then the lynching, I have no way of knowing. I will say that later in her life, Cheryl had asked us in part to recognize Women's History Month. And I noticed when I looked up how that was being celebrated elsewhere, that they were talking about this year in particular, because of the pandemic, women as caregivers and healers. And I initially thought, well, that doesn't describe my great grandmother, Mary Lake Ford, but actually it does, because let's see, this was 1901. By about 1912, her husband had taken ill, and he actually had syphilis, and she had to care for him. He was in and out of the hospital for many years and became a complete invalid, blind and with paralysis. So she was his caregiver. And then shortly before he died, actually, here's William Ellery Board. Shortly before he died, actually, she moved to Louisville and went to work for the Norton Infirmary in Louisville. And this was during it ended up being during the flu pandemic of 1918. And so she was actually, I believe, helping young nurses who were residents there. She was more like a house mother for these young nurses at the Norton Infirmary. So I guess in her way, she was eventually a healer and a caregiver, as the women we're trying to celebrate this year for National History Month. I will make one other note that I believe Tessa makes in her book, but so Mary Lake's son, Lyons Board, married my grandmother and had my mother, their sole child. And my mother, each time Tessa talks about George Carter's wife having to raise these two young daughters alone, reminds me of my mother, who grew up without her father, who she never knew, who never reached out to her, she never met. And then my mother had two daughters who were young when her husband died, and she found herself in that same situation of having to raise two young daughters without a father, the very situation she had had as a young girl, and I'm sure wanted more than anything to avoid, was having two more girls without their fathers around. So anyway, the history just seems to repeat itself generation after generation here, and that just seemed to be a striking coincidence to me.
Thank you all. I want to allow some time for some questions at the end from our participants, but I just kind of want to get your all's perspective on, why you all feel it is important that we continue to uncover or remember and relearn about these traumatic events in our history. How does it help us to move forward when we have these kinds of conversations or write these books or write these articles? Just in your mind, what can be one of our goals for revisiting these topics?
The author of the Paris Daily Enterprise article stated that few people will talk about the incident, and but the word of mouth history still exists. So my primary goal for writing the book was to break the silence and educate not only our citizens, but also the world about the atrocities of mob law, to acknowledge this tragedy as part of our history, and to commit to equal justice for all people. Unfortunately, we will never know whether George Carter was guilty or not, though the Black community was convinced that an innocent man was lynched. Yet there was silence in both the Black and white communities. And I find it ironic, after George was murdered, the incident was reported in every major newspaper across America, north, south, east, west. Then there were decades of silence, suppression of the truth. So that deafening silence has been passed through the generations. And I have to ask myself why. And so not long ago, I watched a documentary about the 1921 Tulsa massacre. And I was again amazed by the silence that followed through the years. And a person in that documentary attributed the decades of silence to ingrained despair. And so I thought those were powerful words, and I had to let that kind of germinate. And as I pondered the meaning of ingrained despair, my thoughts went back to when Africans were kidnapped from their homeland. Then the dehumanization began. They had no legal rights, not allowed to legally marry or be educated, worked harshly, suffered brutal treatment. They were raped, separated from homes, and on and on and on. So even after slavery, ill treatment still continued through passage of Jim Crow laws and the terror by the Ku Klux Klan. How did they cope with the assaults on, and this is continuous on their bodies and minds? Many relied on their religion, yet they could not speak their pain publicly due to fear of retaliation. So this silence was psychologically embedded as a means of survival. So they knew that harm awaited them should they break their silence. And also there was silence in the white community, and it could be that they feared as well, if they did speak up, that they could suffer harm as well. Also, there could be fear of retaliation from the Black community, and it could be an act of neutrality, complicity, or avoidance. So though lynchings are difficult to speak about, it should be impossible to remain silent. And someone has said that speech takes responsibility for our thoughts. So we have to be careful what we state. And I think that when we speak to each other, that we educate one another, but we do it in love. And also breaking the silence makes people uncomfortable. And unfortunately, the tentacles of silence have now been extended to the classroom. So I'm amazed at this, because to abate that uncomfortable feeling in the classroom, states are passing laws to fend off critical examinations of our history. So there are some who feel that to teach about our racism and our history is a form of indoctrinating kids in radical ideologies. So many states have passed laws, others have introduced bills seeking to ban critical race theory. So history teachers have their work cut out for them, I'm afraid, because how are they going to be able to adequately teach about the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement? And so we must remember that history does not stay in the past. History is with us now, and it will always be future. So we're probably in another 100 years, if this world is still around, we'll still be talking about these same issues. And so our goal should be about truth and justice. And we really need to recognize and confront the truth of our past.
Tessa, I think you covered everything I could possibly say on that topic. And I wanted to say how you finished, that this silence that was enforced at the time of slavery and the Jim Crow era, and certainly in this particular incident of this lynching, that silence is now being legislated, just as you were saying, that in the state houses across the United States, we're putting laws in place that restrict how we can talk about these very topics. And that's really, really a concern. And I'm not sure how to battle that at this point. But Tessa and I, our two small contributions were for Tessa to write a book about a very historic incident, and then for me to share that portions of that story through a fictional telling, hoping that that's another way people can imagine how these incidents affect all of the people who are involved, the victims as well as the family and the larger community. And I think we are at a time as I was researching my book, I was amazed at the similarities of the early part of the 20th century and today, especially around the 1920s, just brutal fighting against immigrants and people of color. And it's the laws that were passed during the 1920s to affect all of that. And it's always, one group of people fearing that their rights or their standards, their power is going to be taken away by another group. And we just have to look at that very clearly and very harshly and be prepared to do something to change how we have handled these things in the past. Unfortunately, we're seeing it all happening again today. And we just need to be wide-eyed about it, I guess, and ready to push back in any way that we possibly can.
I do want to say that I think a great example of tearing down that wall of silence, we have a great example, and that's when Sallie and Jim met at the Hopewell Museum in July 2020, and to discuss their ancestors' role in this incident. And I found Sallie's words were very profound. When she opened up this discussion with Jim, she said that she expressed her sorrow on behalf of her ancestors for the pain and suffering the incident caused Jim and his family. And Jim was very appreciative of Sallie's words, and they were so healing. I mean, Sallie and I talk, we feel like Jim has new life now, that these things have come out of the woodwork, and that is no longer hidden, and we're talking about it. And I feel like the healing has actually begun. And my last thought is that I was reading several things the other day, preparing for this meeting, and I saw something that's pretty profound, and leave this with everyone. And this person had said that the noose around one American strangles us all. And I think it's so important that, it's strangling our democracy and our civility. And so we just need to be cognizant of how we proceed in life.
Tessa, I'd like to you mentioned the conversation between Jim Bannister and me, and I want to thank the Hopewell Museum again for making that possible. That was a remarkable day in my life, and I think it was in Jim's too. And I, as an individual, we always ask, what can we do? And I looked at this family story that I had just discovered in recent years, and I thought, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I'm old. I don't feel comfortable getting out and protesting as I had done in recent years. So I thought, what can I do? I can write about my personal story. And this is exactly what I have tried to do, is I've tried to share, I do feel responsibility. I do feel shame. I do feel that I need to do something as a comfortable white person to make this part of our history as clear and as well known as I possibly can. And if I do that by telling my family story over and over again, that's what I can do. And I do it in part now to help Jim Bannister, who is so grateful to Tessa for digging out this information about his family. And he tells me repeatedly that he feels he had a great weight lifted off him, just knowing the truth and knowing what happened and breaking that silence that Tessa was talking about. And of course, she's also helped me break the silence of my family, who never spoke about my grandfather. I knew nothing about him. And now knowing his life story, but also knowing how it integrated with this story in Paris with the lynching of George Carter. It's helped me to grasp a little more about who I am and who my family was and where I fit in the history of this country and the history of Paris.
Thank you all both so much for your insights and your willingness to share what you've learned and this history with us. At this time, I do want to go ahead and see if there are any questions. We've had some people join us, some familiar faces. And if there's anybody who has any questions for either author at this time or just wants to share some information, please remember to unmute yourself to do so. And then we have a few more minutes. So are there any questions, comments?
I see Lendl is on here. What do you have to say, Lendl?
Hey, how you doing? Hey, Sallie, Cheryl, and Tessa. I was just sitting there thinking when you two were talking. I'm sorry I got it late. I just had something to do. That day we did the meeting with Sallie and Jim. I walked away with a whole different perspective and feeling about who I was, and it was just a different feeling. I guess I'm kind of getting a little emotional hearing it a little bit later. It doesn't seem like 2 years later, but it was very profound. It was a profound feeling for me to see them talking, and it was, as you all kind of explained, it was heartfelt. It was warm. It wasn't meanness or anything. It's that healing we need in this country.
Right.
That's what it was, I think. But I'm sorry I got it late, but I'm glad to see you all and hear you all too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'd just like to add to that too, because I'm getting emotional thinking about the relationship I've developed with Jim Bannister too. We met because we knew how our families were interrelated in this incident, that his great uncle had been lynched because of an incident involving my great grandmother. Once we met, we realized we had worked for the same company. We both worked for IBM at one point. We were both crazy avid basketball fans. We talked once every couple of weeks about basketball during the season. We both had run some of the same 5K races in central Kentucky. We had, of course, as you typically would find, we found we had so much more in common than we had that would make us distinct. And so we have really enjoyed a warm relationship and friendship since that day. And that's, again, why I'm grateful for Tessa for putting us together, Lindrell for moderating that conversation, and Cheryl for giving us the space and the place to make that happen.
Sorry. I believe, do we have Cheryl? Are you on the line, Cheryl Bannister?
Finally, yeah. Finally got it together.
I didn't want to point you out, but I believe we have Jim and Cheryl actually on the chat. So thank you all for hanging in there. So any other comments or questions?
I have a question and a comment.
Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, in regard to the silence for so many years and whatnot, don't you think that each horrific incident like this has an arc of how the response is and how people react to try to minimize their involvement, if any, or to not deal with the fact that they may be living with somebody that's involved and they have to stay away from that topic to preserve their own relationship. And then secondly, in that regard, a lot of times bad things that happen like this, it just has to go for a couple of generations or more before it disappears. And the question I had was, do we know what the reaction of the clergy in the city was?
Wow, of course.
That's a fascinating question, Vince. I do not know. I'm going to refer to Tessa. However, I will say I had not even thought about that. Thank you for raising the question. I will say that William Ellery Board, the husband of Mary Lake Board, was deeply involved in the activities of the Christian church there in Paris at that time. And that makes that question even more important, I think. So Tessa, do you have any information?
No, I don't really have any information, any specific information about the clergy. I just know that there was this veil of silence, and and that silence came from for different reasons. And so each person, I think with our history, we have to really be evaluated from a retrospectively, and then we have to do an inward introspective and also prospective, so introspective, retrospectively, I think that we could need to look back at how each of us dealt with that, even our ancestors, but we really don't know the minds of what they were thinking at that time. But I think it's shameful that there was silence and that no one was able to, want to speak out. And I think there was either fear of, if they did speak out against this lynching, that they would have, succumbed to some type of, probably death or, just some retaliation. Others, like I said, that they were probably, they didn't condone it. And then they count, and some condone it. So I just really don't know. I don't know the answer to that specifically.
Well, if I could just add one little short thing here, not trying to take up too much time, but one of the things that has kind of, how would I say, driven me crazy since January 6th is I have never heard anybody that's affiliated with organized religion stand up and call this thing out for what it is.
Right.
And I made a comment, we were having some text the other day, that when our socializing institutions become non-functional, the next thing we do is we tell people to go get firearms. So that's it. Thank you.
I'll make one more comment on Vince's point about just the silence. And that is that I also was part of that silence because I never asked my mother what she knew about her family or any more about her sharing that with me. So I fed right into that silence and didn't feel it was my place to ask about that. And now, of course, I wish I had.
I can add
Sallie,
something.
don't you think I'm sorry.
I was
Go
going to say,
ahead,
I
sir.
can add something to that to help you. The newspaper at the time of what I've read, they were actively pushing racism, dividing the community and stuff. So that's possible what was going on too.
Yes.
Terry, did you have something to comment? Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I just want to thank both of you for what you shared today. But I also had a question along the lines of, when you have a nugget or something like that, how do you find out more? How do you know what happens to people's lives afterwards? Especially if you don't have a whole lot of relatives that are still alive or talking to each other.
Well, I love the genealogy research. And so the way I start building a tree for the person in question.
Okay.
And then, gathering the information. And so for instance, like for Sallie's family, I started a family tree on the ancestry.com. And I pulled all these characters together to who was she married to? Did she have children? And then what type of families did they come from? And so I was able to actually really get into her family business, by just researching on genealogy. And then from there, I would go to like newspapers.com or genealogy bank and start looking up, with their names and trying to trace who are these people? Did they make any contributions to society? Were they jailbirds? Or what type of people they were? And so I was able to really get into the family dynamics by just researching each person. And then it was very helpful once you start, you meet people, like I met Sallie, who had information, about her family. She had the photographs of her grandfather and her great grandmother and others. And so it was just almost a collaborative effort that we had. But that's where I start. I usually start with a family tree, just say, who are the players in this family? What people did they come from? Were they affluent? Were they poor? So it's like it's building a story, but it takes a lot of research. So it takes time.
Thank you.
This is a rather gruesome question, but with George's murder, his lynching, and others, of course, was the body released to the family? I mean, do they know where George is buried specifically, or did the city or county claim the body?
No, from one of the newspapers, and that was in Lexington, we learned that George's father actually helped cut him down from the noose. And he was taken to a local Black funeral parlor. But we do not know where he's buried now. Lindell located the Carter family plot. And we're assuming, that that's the Carter family that we're talking about. Whether or not George was buried there, we do not know.
I'd like to follow up a little bit on that. I'm really curious about what is known about George's father, Tom, I think you said, and what happened with him, and also what was what were his parents like, if you know, and have you traced his history back to enslavement?
The only thing that I traced for his father's name was Thomas, and he went by Tom Carter. I did find him as a young boy on a census, and with his couple of siblings, but that's about all I know about that. It's just that one census report, and seemed like he's pretty handy. I remember Jimmy telling us that he was a man ahead of his time. I mean, he would built his home on let's see, what was the name of the street?
Brook Street.
Vicky used to live on it.
Brook Street.
Yeah, that's right, Brook Street.
Mhm.
Yeah, and on that Brook Street, he had 2 lots, and he had actually built those homes himself, and so he was very a man ahead of him of this time. And I think it was pretty remarkable that it had only been maybe 2 decades since slavery, maybe not that long, when Tom Carter purchased those lots. So I thought that was pretty amazing for that to happen, because for him to move from slavery to a free man, and became a landowner in just a very short period of time. So I felt like he was hardworking, industrious, and I feel like he probably I just can't imagine trying cutting my son down from a noose. But I'm pretty sure that his whole family was traumatized, and I think that's reason why some of their silence on some, and that's because of the pain. And I think it was just they internalized those feelings, and because they really couldn't express it. They couldn't go to the authorities and complain that these people murdered my son, because these authorities actually condoned the situation. So I can only imagine what his father went through. But I don't know if
Tess, I'll just make clear too, I believe you reported in your book that George Carter's parents were both born into slavery because of the era when they were born. And that I think the family had ties to Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. You'll find that interesting, Charlie. So I'll throw that out there too. And also that Tom, George's father, made sure that all of his children were in school. So we had some information that George Carter actually went through whatever was available. I want to say a high school level, even at that time, that was available to him. So education was critically important to Tom Carter's family. And Tessa talks about that in her book. And that's something they I think, Tessa, I'll just make clear too, I believe you reported in your book that George Carter's parents were both born into slavery because of the era when they were born. And that I think the family had ties to Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. You'll find that interesting, Charlie. So I'll throw that out there too. And also that Tom, George's father, made sure that all of his children were in school. So we had some information that George Carter actually went through whatever was available. I want to say a high school level, even at that time, that was available to him. So education was critically important to Tom Carter's family. And Tessa talks about that in her book. And that's something they reinforced because, of course, they had not had that opportunity as young slaves.